I offered to teach him eyeliner, and my hands started shaking. It wasn't supposed to be a big moment. It was supposed to be one of those small, silly couple things, like trying a new recipe that turns into a disaster, or dancing badly in the kitchen because you're both too tired to be cool. A little experiment, a little play, something light. But the second Max sat on the edge of my bed with his knees bouncing and his gaze fixed on my makeup bag like it was a live animal, I felt something in my chest tighten. Maybe it was because he'd asked so carefully, not casually, not with a flirty smirk, not as a dare. He'd asked like he was handing me a fragile thing. "Janet," he'd said earlier that day, leaning against my kitchen counter while I rinsed strawberries. "Can I ask you something without it being weird?" I dried my hands on a dish towel and turned to him. "You can ask me anything." He'd looked down at his fingers, then back up at me with this raw honesty that still undid me, even months into dating. "Would you ever show me how you do your eyeliner?" I blinked, surprised. Not because the question was wrong, but because it was so specific, so tender, so intimate in a way that didn't feel like romance in the traditional sense. It felt like someone asking, "Can you let me borrow your softness for a minute?" "Yeah," I'd said immediately. "Of course." And then he'd smiled, small and relieved, like he'd expected the answer to be no. Now, in my bedroom, the afternoon light slanted through the blinds in warm stripes. My cat, Fig, had claimed a patch of sun on the carpet and looked at us with the bored judgment of someone who pays rent by being cute. Max sat still, hands folded like he'd been instructed to. He wore a plain black t-shirt and dark jeans, his hair damp from a shower, the ends curling slightly at his ears. He had the kind of face that drew you in without trying. Strong brow, soft mouth, eyes that could look amused or distant depending on what he was carrying. Today, he looked braced. I unzipped my makeup bag and started pulling things out on the dresser, lining them up like tools on a surgical tray. A pencil liner, a liquid pen, a couple brushes. And my favorite palette, the one I always reached for when I needed grounding. The mirror was smudged from constant use, and the edges were worn where my fingers had held it 1,000 times. Max watched each item land like it mattered. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to," I reminded him, because consent is a habit I've learned to make visible. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I wanted him to trust the space between us. He nodded quickly. "I want to," he said. Then, after a beat, he added, "I'm just not used to asking." "Not used to asking for what?" I asked gently, even though I had a feeling. He shrugged, shoulders lifting and dropping like he could shake the answer off. "For things that feel like this." I sat on the stool by the dresser and patted the bed beside him. "Come closer," I said. "We'll go slow." He scooted forward until he was facing me. The air felt suddenly too quiet, like the room had leaned in. I could hear the hum of the radiator, the faint traffic outside, the soft click of Fig's tail against the floor. I tilted my head. "Okay. First lesson, you're allowed to blink." He huffed a laugh, tension breaking slightly. "Good, because I'm probably going to blink a lot." "That's normal," I said. "Eyeliner is basically an extreme sport." His smile widened, and for a second he looked like himself again, playful, bright, present. Then his gaze flicked toward the mirror, and the braced feeling returned, as if he'd remembered he was doing something that required courage. I picked up the palette and flipped it open. "We'll start with something soft," I said. "Not a sharp wing, just definition." Max swallowed. "Okay." I dipped a brush into a dark brown shadow, not black, because black can feel harsh and unforgiving. Brown was gentler, more forgiving, like training wheels. "Look down," I instructed. He did. His lashes lowered, and my heart did something stupid in my chest. There's a particular kind of vulnerability in someone closing their eyes for you. It's trust without words. I lifted my hand toward his face, and that's when my fingers started shaking. Not dramatically, not like a movie. A small tremor, just enough to make me pause. I stared at my own hand, annoyed at my body for betraying me at the worst moment. Max opened one eye. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I lied, automatically. Then I corrected myself because I'm trying to be a person who doesn't lie out of reflex. "Actually, I'm nervous." He sat up a little straighter. "Why?" And I could have said 100 safe answers. Because eyeliner is hard. Because I don't want to poke your eye. Because this lighting is weird. But the truth was more complicated. Because this feels intimate, I admitted quietly. Not in a sexual way, just close. Max's shoulders eased, like hearing that gave him permission to feel the same thing. "Yeah," he murmured. "It does." I took a breath and steadied my wrist by anchoring the side of my hand against his cheekbone the way makeup artists do. "Okay," I said. "Tell me if anything feels uncomfortable." He nodded, lips pressed together. I touched the brush to his lash line, barely grazing. He flinched at first, then settled. His skin was warm under my fingers. The room smelled faintly like his soap, clean and cedarish, and the sweetness of the candle I'd burned earlier. "Good," I whispered, more to myself than him. "You're doing great." He made a small sound, like he wanted to laugh but didn't want to move. "Relax your forehead," I teased softly. "You're concentrating like you're defusing a bomb." He let out a breath. "It feels like that." I worked slowly, applying the shadow in small strokes, smudging it so it looked soft and lived in. I didn't want him to look like he was wearing makeup for someone else. I wanted it to look like he'd stepped into a version of himself that had always been there, just waiting for permission. When I finished the first eye, I leaned back. "Okay," I said. "Open." Max blinked a few times, then turned toward the mirror, eyes widening slightly as he took in the change. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't make him look like a different person. It made him look emphasized, like someone had turned up the contrast on a photograph. His mouth parted. "Whoa." "Good whoa?" I asked. He nodded, still staring. "Yeah, it's subtle, but it changes everything." "Right?" I smiled. "It's like your eyes are telling the truth louder." He looked at me then, and something in his gaze flickered, something tender and startled, like he hadn't expected to feel anything beyond curiosity. "Can we do the other eye?" he asked. "Of course," I said, trying to sound casual, even as my chest tightened again. I turned the palette in my hands, and the light caught the powdery surface where my fingertips had been. Smudges, prints, proof that this wasn't just a concept. It was happening. He was here. I was doing it. We were making something real with something as ordinary as pigment. As I leaned in again, Max's breathing changed. Slower, deeper, like he'd decided to trust the process. Like he'd decided to trust me. "Look down," I said softly. He lowered his eyes. My brush hovered over his lid, and the tremor returned. Less from nerves now, and more from the weight of the moment. I steadied my hand the same way, thumb resting against his cheek, the heel of my palm anchored. I smudged the shadow along his lash line, careful and patient. And as I worked, I noticed things you only notice when you're inches from someone. The faint scar near his eyebrow, the way his lashes curved, the tiny freckle near his temple. The softness of his skin in places he probably never thought of as soft. I thought about how many faces I'd painted in my life. My own, my friends, my cousin's before her wedding. Makeup had always been a language of transformation for me, but also a language of care. A way to say, I'm here, I'm paying attention, I'm making time. And suddenly I wondered, how often had anyone made time like this for Max? When I finished, I leaned back again. "Okay," I said gently. "Look." He turned toward the mirror, and this time he didn't just react. He studied himself. He stared like he was trying to recognize something. His eyes were shiny, and I wasn't sure if it was the light or emotion. "Max?" I asked carefully. He swallowed. "It's weird," he said. "What's weird?" He laughed softly, but it didn't sound happy. It sounded overwhelmed. "I feel pretty." The word hung in the air. Pretty, not handsome, not cool, not tough. Pretty, soft and unguarded and almost dangerous to admit. I felt something expand in my chest. "You are," I said simply. He blinked hard and looked away quickly, embarrassed by his own tenderness. I reached for the cotton pad and micellar water. "We can take it off anytime," I offered. "It doesn't have to leave this room." Max shook his head. "No, I don't want to take it off yet." "Okay," I said, and tried to keep my voice steady. We sat there for a second, the quiet stretching between us. Fig shifted in his sunspot, flicking his tail like he approved of the pause. Then Max said, barely audible, "Can you do the liquid liner too?" My breath caught. "You want a wing?" He gave a small, almost mischievous smile. "I want to try." I should have teased him. I should have said, "Bold choice, sir." I should have kept it light. Instead, I felt the room deepen, like we'd stepped off a curb we hadn't noticed. "Okay," I whispered. "But we're going to do it together. I'll guide your hand." He nodded. I grabbed the liquid liner pen. The click of the cap coming off sounded loud. "Rest your elbow on the dresser," I instructed. "Okay, hold it like this." I placed the pen in his hand, adjusting his fingers gently. His hand shook too. He laughed, a short burst. "Oh no." "It's okay," I said. "Everyone shakes. Eyeliner is basically a test of faith." He breathed out, shoulders lifting and dropping. "Okay." I positioned myself behind him slightly, close enough that my knees brushed the back of his thighs, close enough that my breath warmed the side of his neck. I wrapped my hand around his hand, not gripping, just supporting, and guided the pen toward his eye. "Look straight," I murmured, "and don't hold your breath." He exhaled, then inhaled, trying to steady himself. The first line was wobbly. He groaned. "I ruined it." "You didn't ruin anything," I said calmly. "You made a line. That's the goal. We can clean it up." He looked at me through the mirror, a flash of frustration and fear. "I'm bad at this." "Max," I said softly and met his gaze. "You're learning. Those are different things." His shoulders loosened slightly. I took a cotton swab, dipped it in micellar water, and gently cleaned the edge of the line. "See?" I said. "Nothing is ruined. We just adjust." He watched me do it like he was watching a magic trick. When I finished, his eyes met mine again in the mirror, and something about the way he looked, so stunned by gentleness, made my throat tighten. There were other times in our relationship where I'd felt how careful he was, how he'd ask before touching me in certain ways, like he was determined not to repeat something. How he'd flinch if I raised my voice even slightly, not because he was fragile, but because his body had learned raised voices meant danger. How he'd always clean the kitchen before leaving, like he didn't want to be accused of taking up space. I hadn't pushed him about his past. I'd let him set the pace. But in moments like this, the past leaked through in quiet ways. I cleaned up the other eye, smudged the shadow again, softened the edges. The look was subtle but undeniable. Max's eyes looked bigger, more awake, more expressive, like the world could read him more clearly. He touched his cheek with the tips of his fingers, careful not to smear anything. "I can't believe this is my face," he murmured. "It's always been your face," I said. "You're just seeing it differently." He turned to look at me, and his expression was strange, half awe, half ache, like he didn't know what to do with tenderness that wasn't attached to a price. "Do you want lipstick?" I asked, trying to bring the moment back to safe ground. Max laughed softly. "Maybe not today." "Fair," I smiled. "We can stop anytime." He nodded and then, unexpectedly, reached for my palette. He held it in both hands, turning it over, tracing the worn edges with his thumb. His thumb left a faint mark of powder on the plastic. "I like this," he said, almost to himself. "My palette?" I asked, amused. He shook his head and looked up at me. "No, this." He gestured between us, his eyeliner, the brush, my hands. "I like being taken seriously." My heart thumped. Of course I'm taking you seriously. He stared at me for a long beat. Then he looked down again, and his voice dropped to something that sounded like it had been hiding behind his ribs for years. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. I nodded. "Always." He swallowed hard. His fingers tightened around the palette as if it were an anchor. "When I was younger," he began, then stopped. He breathed in, the breath catching. "I tried makeup once, not like full face, just eyeliner, like you're doing, and someone saw." My stomach tightened. I didn't interrupt. He continued, eyes fixed on the palette. "It wasn't even a big deal. It was just me trying something. But he shook his head. "They laughed. They called me disgusting. He stopped again, jaw clenching. "They grabbed my face." The words landed like stones. I felt my hands curl into fists in my lap, rage rising sharp and fast. "Who?" I asked, voice tight. Max shook his head quickly. "It doesn't matter." "It matters," I said, but softened immediately when I saw his shoulders tense. "Okay, you don't have to tell me." He exhaled shakily. It made me feel like my face didn't belong to me. Like it was something other people could claim and mock and punish. My throat burned. I reached for his wrist gently, not to take the palette away, just to remind him he wasn't alone. "I'm so sorry," I whispered. He nodded once, eyes still down. For a moment, the room felt too small for what he'd just revealed. The sunlight had shifted, the stripes on the floor angling differently as the afternoon moved on. Fig stretched and yawned, completely unconcerned by human heartbreak. I took a slow breath and said, "Max, you don't have to earn gentleness." He looked up then, and the eyeliner made his gaze even more intense, even more open. His voice was barely a whisper. "No one has touched my face kindly before." The sentence hit me so hard I felt it in my bones. I didn't respond with a dramatic gasp. I didn't say something big and polished. I just let my face soften, let my eyes water, and reached for him carefully, like he was a skittish animal and I didn't want to spook him. "Is it okay if I touch you now?" I asked, because I needed him to choose it. He nodded, throat moving like he was swallowing emotion. "Yes." I lifted my hands and cupped his face. Slow, gentle, palms warm against his cheeks. His skin felt impossibly human. I held him like that for a moment, and I could feel the tremor in him easing, tiny muscle by tiny muscle. He closed his eyes. When he exhaled, it sounded like something unhooking. I brushed my thumbs along his cheekbones, careful not to smudge his eyeliner. I leaned forward and kissed his forehead, soft, lingering, not demanding anything from him except presence. He made a small sound, half laugh, half sob. "I'm here," I whispered. He opened his eyes, and they were wet, but he didn't look away this time. He didn't apologize. He didn't try to make it lighter for my comfort. "I didn't realize it would feel like this," he admitted. "Me neither," I said honestly, my voice thick. "I thought it would just be makeup." Max's mouth quirked slightly. "It is just makeup." "And it isn't," I said. He nodded, like he understood. For a while we sat in the quiet, my hands still on his face, his fingers still holding the palette. If you looked at us from the outside, it might have seemed ordinary. Two people sitting on a bed, one of them wearing smudged eyeliner. But inside the moment, it felt enormous. Like we'd found a door we didn't know existed. Eventually, Max cleared his throat. "Can I keep it on for a little?" he asked. "Of course," I said, smiling through tears. "We can go get coffee, we can go for a walk, we can stay here, whatever you want." He looked terrified for a split second, like imagining the world seeing him was too much. Then he nodded slowly. Maybe just a walk, at dusk, when it's not as bright. Okay, I said immediately. Dusk walk. He set my palette down on the bed, and when he did, I saw it. Powdery fingerprints on the edge of the mirror, smudges in the brown shade we'd used, tiny marks in places I didn't usually touch because my hands weren't as careful as his. Proof. I don't know why that moved me so much, but it did. That little physical evidence that he'd been here, that he'd tried, that he'd left part of himself behind in a way that wasn't messy or destructive, just human. Later, as we got ready to leave, he stood in front of my mirror again. He didn't pose. He didn't perform. He just looked. I came up behind him and rested my hands lightly on his shoulders. How do you feel? I asked. He thought about it. Exposed, he said honestly. Then, after a beat, but also real. I kissed his shoulder through the fabric of his shirt. You are real, I murmured. You've always been. He turned his head slightly, meeting my eyes in the mirror. You make it feel safe, he said quietly. I wanted to tell him I'd always be that for him. I wanted to swear it like an oath. But I'm learning that promises aren't what make people safe. Consistency does. The everyday choices. The way you show up. So instead, I said, we'll keep practicing. Only if you want, and only at your pace. Max nodded, a slow, grateful motion. I want, he said. We left my apartment just as the sun started to dip, the city softening at the edges. The hallway smelled faintly of someone's dinner. Outside, the air was cooler, and the streetlights flickered on like tiny permissions. Max kept his face forward at first, shoulders a little tight. But as we walked, the tension eased. He didn't hide behind me. He didn't yank his hood up. He just existed. A man with softly smudged eyeliner walking beside his girlfriend like it was normal. Every now and then, someone glanced at him. Most people didn't care. A couple people smiled. One barista at the corner cafe looked at his eyes and said, "Love your liner," like it was the most ordinary compliment in the world. Max froze, then looked at me like he didn't know what to do. "Say thank you," I whispered, smiling. He swallowed, then turned back to the barista. "Thank you," he said, voice small but steady. As we walked away, he exhaled hard. "That was nice," he said, sounding shocked. "Yeah," I said. "It was." When we got back to my place, the first thing Max did was pick up the palette again. He held it up to the light, studying the fingerprints like they were a map. "I want to remember this," he said quietly. "You can," I said, and took the palette from him gently. "We have proof." I angled it so he could see the faint smudges, the powdery marks. He laughed softly. "Your palette is evidence." "It is," I smiled. "Exhibit A, you were brave." His expression softened and something bright and tender lived there. "Exhibit B," he said, nodding toward my hands. "You were kind." I felt heat in my cheeks. "I'm always kind," he raised an eyebrow. "You yelled at a pigeon last week." "That pigeon was being disrespectful," I said immediately, and he laughed, a real laugh, loose and warm. Then his laughter faded and his gaze turned serious again, the way it often did when something mattered. "Janet," he said. "Yeah?" He hesitated, then reached up and touched the side of his face, as if confirming it still belonged to him. "I didn't know it could feel gentle," he admitted. "I didn't know I could feel cared for like that." My throat tightened. I stepped closer, careful, always careful. "You deserve gentleness," I said. "Not because you did something brave today, just because you're you." Max's eyes filled again. He blinked and nodded like he was trying to absorb the words without breaking. I lifted my hands, paused an inch from his cheeks, and asked, "Can I?" He nodded. "Yes." I cupped his face again, thumbs resting lightly along his cheekbones, and this time his body didn't flinch. He leaned into my hands like he'd been waiting for that softness his whole life. We stayed there for a long time. No rush, no performance. Just the quiet truth of touch given kindly and received without fear. And later, when we finally washed his face, when the eyeliner swirled down the drain like a little dark river, he didn't look sad. He looked peaceful. Because it wasn't about the eyeliner, not really. It was about the permission. The permission to try, to be seen, to be cared for without being mocked for it. The permission for his face to be his own again. The permission for tenderness to exist without a trap. I put the palette back in my makeup bag afterward, but I didn't wipe it clean right away. I left the fingerprints there for a few days, powdery little ghosts, because sometimes you need proof that a moment happened. Proof that you didn't imagine the softness. Proof that someone trusted you with something fragile and you didn't drop it. And every time I opened that palette and saw the smudges, I remembered the way my hands shook at the start, not because I was afraid of eyeliner, but because I could feel the weight of what we were really doing. I offered to teach him eyeliner, and my hands started shaking, because somewhere inside that tiny act was a bigger one. I was touching him the way no one had touched him before. Kindly,